Now I'd like to introduce one by one these exceptional panelists. We've had a variety of individuals throughout the world. We've had communal leaders, we've had legislators, we've had international jurists, we've had ordinary farmers who object to the United Nations because of unelected governance. People far away on a distant continent telling them what they can and cannot do with their own water on their own farms. So there are a lot of different reasons for people to come together. I now introduce to you one of the most knowledgeable men on international relations and the state of international diplomacy, especially regarding the Middle East, my friend Sheldon Freilich, president of the ZOA, Michigan. Sheldon. Thank you.
Thank you for the warm words. After the tyranny and genocidal murder of the Second World War, the United Nations was founded in 1945. It was a specific creation by those nations who defeated the horrendous evils of fascism and committed to international peace and security and the sovereign equality of all nations. Yet, in a long list of shameful failures, the UN has ignored genocidal and other murderous campaigns around the world. The UN has allowed and enabled dictatorships and Islamist nations and groups to penetrate and subvert the norms of international law. A select few of the UN's failures. Rwanda, 1994. Kofi Annan, then Secretary General of the UN, knew weeks in advance about plans for the extermination of the minority Tutsis in Rwanda. Extermination in quotes, because that was the information that came to Mr. Annan. But he told UN military personnel in the country not to take any action, according to reports. The genocide campaign, which left 500,000 Tutsis dead, began in 1994 and lasted for 3 months, uninterrupted by outside intervention. As an example of the UN unwilling and unable to act on information from the field about a massive slaughter, and even its actions in response, once they began late, were ineffective. Cambodia, approximately 1.7 million people, or 21% of the country's population, were killed during the Pol Pot and Khmer Rouge reign of terror and atrocities in the Cambodian genocide spanning 4 years in 1975 to 1979. The UN effectively watched from the sidelines, even though reports detailing the massacres emerged from Cambodia. Sudan. In 2003, the unstable nation of Sudan erupted in conflict as various militia groups criticized and attacked the government for oppressing non-Arabs. The government funded a group of Arab militants. By 2005, this group, Janjaweed, were carrying out systematic attacks on civilians, including murder, torture, rape, and attacks on populated villages using artillery and helicopters. There was condemnation by then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. There were even reports that the Sudanese military planes were painted white to resemble UN humanitarian aircraft to drop bombs on villages. Despite this condemnation, the UN did not enter Sudan, and instead urging members of the African Union to intervene. The fighting continued until 2010. 300,000 people were killed and a further 2.7 million displaced. Once again, the UN efforts were too little, too late. International terrorism. Many experts agree that modern terrorism began with the 1968 hijacking of El Al Israel Flight 426 in 1968 to Algeria by 3 members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of And these kind of terrorist hijackings and other acts continued out throughout the remainder of the 20th century with no reaction from the United Nations. With the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the UN finally did take action and outlawed terrorism, but they applied it to only Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, ignoring other terrorist programs such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iranian-sponsored terrorism. Hezbollah in Lebanon. The United Nations interim force in Lebanon's most notorious collaboration with terrorists involved the kidnapping and murder of 3 Israeli soldiers and the subsequent cover-up. In 2000, Hezbollah terrorists clad in UN uniforms entered Israel, attacked and kidnapped 3 Israeli soldiers. The kidnapping was attacked by several dozen UNIFIL soldiers who stood idle. There is evidence of payments by Hezbollah to the UNIFIL brigade, including hundreds of thousands of dollars for assistance in the kidnapping and cover-up. The UN cover-up began almost immediately, including refusal to release automobile evidence and videotapes, both of which might have helped the Israelis rescue the kidnapped victims. In 2004, January, the bodies of the 3 murdered Israelis were returned to Israel by Hezbollah as part of a prisoner exchange. Anti-Semitism. The UN has an irredeemable bias against Israel. According to UN Watch, in 2016, Israel was condemned 20 times compared to 6 condemnations for the rest of the world combined. Even, and this is about 2 days ago, even current UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres admits that denial of Israel's right to exist is a modern form of anti-Jewish hatred, and said that Israel has the right to be treated like any other UN member state. But he further admitted that he could not control all expressions of bias against Israel at the United Nations. On the same day, in December 2016, when the UN Security Council adopted, with the consent of U.S. President Obama's administration, its anti-Israel settlements and anti-Jewish libels, the Security Council was unable to muster a majority to approve an arms embargo and sanctions against South Sudan. Even though South Sudan, in the words of outgoing Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, is on the verge of genocide, the Security Council stood by and did nothing while patting itself on the back for going after Israel. Eradication of the Christian community in the Middle East is ongoing and has been for a number of years, again, an atrocity ignored by the United Nations. Human Rights Council. Despite its height, the UN's contribution to human rights is minimal at best, and at times negative. Its Human Rights Council, or I call it its Inhumane Council, has some of the world's worst human rights abusers as members. As a result, dictatorial countries get a slap on the wrist, while the only democracy in the Middle East, Israel, is condemned more than all the other member states of the UN combined. The Human Rights Council uses this vehicle to concentrate its venom on Israel with the objective of delegitimizing the Jewish state. Diplomacy to prevent conflict. The UN touts itself as one of its major contributions that it uses, quote, diplomacy to prevent conflict. Yet, the UN has failed as an institution to end major conflicts, most notably in Syria, where there's been 400,000 deaths, as well as other examples in other countries. One final comment. As Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu recently said, if the powers in 1942 had acted against the Nazi death camps, and all that was needed was a repeated bombing of the camps, had they acted then, they would have saved 4 million Jews and millions of other people. The powers knew and they did not act. The genocidal crimes of the Nazi regime and its collaborators were globally enabled in the 1933 to 1945 era. Just as a republic of democracies was needed at that time to prevent the horrors of World War II, so it is time to defund the ineffective United Nations and create an effective family of democratic nations for the 21st century.
Thank you, Shelley, for that brief distillation of what could have gone on for hours, which is example after example. What Sheldon Freilich's summary has shown us is that the quest for a truly democratic international body to bring countries together and avoid the type of conflicts we have is not a Kurdish issue. It is not an issue for the people of Aleppo. It is not a Sudanese issue. It is not a Cambodian issue. It is not an Israeli issue. It is not a Rwandan issue. It is an issue for all mankind, for all peoples in national identities that exist or wish to exist, whether they are Kurdish, whether they are South Sudanese, whether they are Chaldean, whether they are Maronite. All these people deserve to live and live in freedom and security, and that cannot be done as long as we have a feckless and impotent United Nations that by its very inability to act encourages the most heinous crimes in the history of mankind. Thank you very much once again, Shelley. And now I'd like to introduce Marty Adelman. Marty Adelman is from George Washington University. As many of you know, George Washington University is not in Detroit, it's in Washington. However, Marty Adelman has an international imprint around the world on matters of intellectual property and jurisprudence, and he is very familiar with international law as it applies to the areas under his purview. And I now want to welcome Marty Adelman, who will speak for 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Well, this is obviously a big topic, and I thought, maybe we ought to go back and read the founding document of the United Nations. And in it, it creates several institutions, but they're different institutions. One is the General Assembly. Now, I know some United Nations organizations, and the General Assembly is a place where people talk. The power is somewhere else. In the United Nations, it's the same thing. If there's any power at all, it's in the Security Council. Now, the Security Council was created by the victors of the Second World War. Not surprisingly, they set that up, and it's remained so to this day. And the most powerful, at least in the post-war period, of that group has been the United States. So when I listen to the failures of the United Nations, which are legion, I view it as an anti-Semitic cesspool. I wonder how much of this is due to the failures of the United States, because our State Department is probably an anti-Semitic cesspool. If you just read the resolution 2334, which we let pass and probably wrote, because nothing passes in the Security Council without the approval of the United States. It's just plainly an anti-Semitic document, as we know. Now, whose fault is that? Is it the United Nations? Or maybe the United States? Now, UNESCO is just a cesspool of anti-Semitism. We have been funding all their activities. Now let's talk about the special refugee program set up. Who funds it? The Europeans and the Americans. Now, who's to blame for it? I view it's the funders. And I wonder, okay, we should have another organization that would be idealistic, and that would be absolutely great. And maybe it would put pressure on the United Nations, because competition is always good, and if there was real competition. But I wonder, well, why don't we use our power of the purse? And we're still the most important country in the world. I know China wants to dispute that, but that's ridiculous. So, if we are, let's pressure President Trump, who I think his instincts are with us, to squeeze the United Nations. And if they have organizations that are a cesspool of anti-Semitism and aren't doing good things, we cut them off. The Bush administration actually cut UNESCO off, and the Obama administration decided to pay them, and the Obama administration then abstained from every one of their anti-Israel votes and then paid for everything that they were doing. So much can be done by the United States, and I personally would like to see our effort go to reforming the State Department. This may happen under Tillerson, Secretary Tillerson, and to pressure the United Nations to reform. And Nikki Haley is starting to do it. She's probably your next woman president, or your first woman president of the United States, in my view. And she is single-handedly putting the screws to those people. As you can see by listening now to the Secretary General, all of a sudden he's making these statements which no Secretary General made before. Yes, he can't control everybody, but who cares? Many people just talk, many countries talk, it doesn't matter. But she may be able to single-handedly do something with the backing of Secretary Tillerson and President Trump. So we will see, but we should push for that. If this new organization, which would be wonderful if it was created, can keep the pressure on, fine. But I want to see the power of the purse used, because the United States is still key. And if these people don't shape up, we could just pull the lease and tell them to go to Rwanda and see how many restaurants they can eat at in that city. I think that would shake them up very quickly.
Okay, thank you very much. So there we have the view of someone who's actually steeped in international jurisprudence, and of course it's a highly opinionated view. And one of the things about this panel and the panels we've had around the world is we encourage all conversation, all comments which join us and which disagree with us and which diverge, and that's the beauty, and I very much appreciate your remarks. Although we brought up a few ideas, I'll be picking up those things with greater precision in just a few minutes. Now I'd like to introduce a dear friend of mine, a man that I consider to be a great icon, a treasure, not of Michigan, but of the United States, and that is Dr. William Anderson, my friend Bill, who marched shoulder to shoulder with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He has been a civil rights icon. He's an inspiration to me and to many others, and I'm so happy that he's been able to join us to make a few brief remarks and then answer some questions. Then I'll follow him with my own personal statement. Please give it up for Bill Anderson.
As you notice, he said a few brief remarks, and I'm a Baptist preacher, by the way.
What's that, a half hour?
Thank you. Yeah, right. I was brave enough to bring my friend, Edwin Black, to campus at Michigan State University. I cannot say it is the most liberal university in the United States. And there were some on campus who would say, why would you bring him to campus? I say, you need to hear the other side. All issues have at least two sides. Is that right, Marty?
Absolutely.
At least two sides. And of course, I'm a disciple of Martin Luther King Jr., and all of you will remember him. And you remember specifically what he said, injustice anywhere is a threat to injustice everywhere. And so I'm saying that I don't care where the injustice exists, and I'm glad that you did not limit it to just, Detroit, Michigan, or out here in West Bloomfield. It's everywhere. Let me just tell you a little bit about me, about myself, because all of a sudden, coming into the room, I saw Sue Adelman. Did you know that Sue Adelman and I go back about 50 years? You did not know she was that old, did she? Marty, you know she's that old.
I did know.
But Sue Adelman and Winnie, raise your hand over there. Here's another one of my colleagues. We worked together for the good of the people that we were privileged to serve. Is that right? And we did not care about the color, their religion, their culture, where they came from. We only cared about taking care of them because they were human beings. And we felt as though they deserved the same opportunity as anyone else to good health care, and we tried to give them that. So, let me tell you a couple other things about me, and I will not be brief. Edwin, you can be brief when you want to. I joined a fraternity at Des Moines, what is now Des Moines University, back in the day when a black could not join a fraternity on campus, except it was a Jewish fraternity, LOG, Lambda Omicron Gamma. I was led into that fraternity on campus where no other black had ever joined a fraternity on campus except I was taken in by the Jewish fraternity on campus, which said to me, the Jews did not care about my color. They were more concerned about my character. Isn't that what Martin Luther King said? They cared more about my character. What kind of a student was I? What kind of doctor was I ever going to be? Well, Sheldon, I'm so happy to be here with you. And I'm so happy to see people like Sue Adelman here and my friend Winnie over here. These are people that I have come to know, not because they were Jews, but then let us come to the realization that Jews and blacks had a common beginning. Did you know that? We all came out of slavery, and we cannot go out of slavery and leave the others behind. If I then believe in equality and justice, I cannot leave my brothers and my sisters in slavery while I enjoy all of the elements of this free society. And so I'm happy to be here. Can't we just get along? Somebody else said that. Can't we
You don't want to be here.
But guess where there is a will, to get along and to help each other and to attack these injustices wherever they may exist, where there is a will to do so, it can be done. And let me say this, I'm almost done. Most of you have heard of the Emancipation Proclamation, over 150 years ago now. Emancipation Proclamation that was signed by a very brave president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, who said all people in this country must be free. He said that. It cost him his life. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free slaves. Write that down, would you? The Emancipation Proclamation did not free slaves any more than the United Nations can free Jews. Here, there is no single document that can free people. People have to have the will to be free and be willing to make the necessary sacrifices so that we all can be free. Can I go back to Martin Luther King? So if we all cannot be free, how can some of us be free? I'm going to stop there. I have a whole lot more to say, but the moderator said that I'm limited to 3 minutes, and
That's for the start. Another 3 minutes for your finish.
all right, thank you very much. Okay. Would you pass that over? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And, okay, so I wanted to thank my friend Bill Anderson for expressing the heart and soul of the effort for all people to be treated with equality. Civil rights is human rights, and civil rights and human rights prosper under democracy. And there are times when persecution of minorities is not local, but becomes national or international, as in the case of America's own segregation, as in the case of South African apartheid, as in the case of the Jews in Germany, and as the case of the Yazidis and the Shia now experiencing what they're experiencing in Syria, the Coptics in Egypt, and many other groups. And so I would just like to say that I always draw inspiration from Bill Anderson, what he says and how he says it, and the fact that he comes from a long tradition of fighting for civil rights, human rights, and equal rights on the local stage and in the international arena. Thank you, Bill. So now I will make my opening statement, which I think will complement what the other gentlemen have said. I'll lean on my own strength, which is history. Let's look at the United Nations and how it all started. It started, of course, as the League of Nations. The League of Nations started an organization after World War I, created by the victors. And the victors started this organization for the purpose of exacting revenge against their enemy, the German Empire and the Adelman Empire. Germany had colonies in Africa, and the Ottoman Empire had colonies on 3 continents, including all of the Middle East. They added to that sense of revenge a desire to provide self-determination for individual groups who sought to identify themselves according to their religion or their identity or their culture or their language or their geographic location, to achieve national rights or nationalism and to determine their own affairs and not be governed by faraway capitals. They thought that the war to end all wars would create an organization that would be the peace to ensure all peaces. But in point of fact, The League of Nations was driven by one overwhelming desire that was more than greed, more than a desire to help achieve self-determination, more than the decolonization. They were driven by the greed for oil. And that oil, as I'm sure some people in the audience know, was in Iraq. That oil was in Iran. And they wanted the allies from the League of Nations, that would be France and England, wanted that oil to flow down to one pipeline in Lebanon and one pipeline in Haifa to go across the Mediterranean, because they needed oil in France, England, the other parts of Europe. And to achieve that, they took a ruler and they invented countries that never existed. In 1920, after World War I, they invented Lebanon. They invented Syria. They invented Iraq. Then they actually, in addition to creating 3 Arab states, they made a Jewish state, which was Jewish Palestine, so that all groups could have a role and achieve self-determination. And then they took 80% of that off in 1920 and invented Jordan with a memo, not with a referendum. But on September 23rd, 1922, Winston Churchill wrote a memo and created Jordan out of 3 nearly empty provinces of the Ottoman Empire. So now Israel was left with a small bit. The League of Nations didn't do a good job of standing up to tyranny. It actually enforced tyranny against many in the Middle East. After all, the British considered whether they would drop gas bombs on the Iraqis because they objected to their presence. The League of Nations did not stand up to Germany. In fact, for a short period of time, Nazi Germany was part of the League of Nations. By their own fecklessness, by their own aphasia, they encouraged the rise of Nazism. They stood by and encouraged the takeover of Europe. And so at the end of World War II, they gave way to yet a new organization to replace it. It actually was destined to take their assets, about $8 billion in League of Nations assets went into the United Nations. The agencies of the League of Nations went into the United Nations. And this new organization, the United Nations, was a fraud from the minute it was created. It was supposed to be a democratic organization. But how is that possible when the 5 commanding and determining powers that create the Security Council were not only France, England, and the United States, the Allies, but they were Stalinist Russia and civil war-torn China. So how could they have a democratic agenda? And then by their own increase, by their own inclusion, by their own addition of other imaginary states that they created for oil purposes, without a thought to democratic ideals, they added to their number, and from the original 29 states, it is now gone on to well over 100 states, mainly non-democratic states, and anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, created the famous resolution or infamous that Zionism is racism, when Zionism was built into the League of Nations Charter and the San Remo Convention in Article 6 and Article 4, that the Zionist Organization was actually supposed to be the internationally selected organization to settle Jews there. And yet, late now, we see the UN says Zionism is racism. Yes, that was defeated. It was overturned. It was a long, hard fight. But if you just listen to the litany that Shell has given about Cambodia, about Rwanda, about what's happening in Aleppo, you see how feckless and incapable of taking action the United Nations is. And so it wasn't with a UN resolution That's 60 Tomahawks, one of which fell into the sea in '59, which took out 20% of the Syrian Air Force. It wasn't with a UN resolution that under Chapter 7 that was done. That was done by multilateralism, unilateralism. World War II was not fought by the League of Nations. It was fought by the Allies. And therefore, we now see that the United Nations has had its moment, and that moment has come and gone. The United States, Marty Adelman said, what are we paying for it? We're paying 22% of the budget. That's $9 billion a year. That's $90 billion in a decade. If we pull it, no one's going to replace it. It will not come from Iran. Iran will not make up $90 billion. Iran needs $135 a barrel to fund its international activities, its nuclear program, and its terrorism, and they're only getting $50 to $60 a barrel now. Saudi Arabia will not fund it. Saudi Arabia needs $75 a barrel just to run the nation. And as I say, they're only getting $60 a barrel. We can do it. The League of Nations, I disagree with Marty, or perhaps something Marty almost said, the United Nations cannot be reformed. You can no sooner reform the United Nations as you can reform the mafia. These people have a mission based on their values, and those values are not democratic values. And so, my idea that I have started all on my own, without permission, without funding, around the world, is to start a new organization. Now, many people have said, let us start a new organization. But no one has named it. And no one has given it the type of purpose and identity that we have until this moment. And that will be the Covenant of Democratic Nations. And this Covenant of Democratic Nations will be limited to a membership just of democratic nations, and there are many ways to define a democratic nation. We have a website, covenantofdemocraticnations.org, and there's a declaration there that talks about a democratic nation with checks and balances. It talks about equal treatment for minorities and different categories of groups, and everyone will, it's kind of like what the Supreme Court once said, I know it when I see it, and so the democratic nations will be the only ones admitted as full members with voting rights. I've heard people here say, you won't get enough to do a minyan, which is the Jewish prayer group that needs 10 people a day. We've got enough democratic nations in Latin America, or emerging democratic nations, to join this new group. We've got 10 there. That's a minyan. We've got at least 10 Muslim majority nations in Central Asia, Tajikistan, and Azerbaijan, and many others. I was with these people in December with 13 ambassadors from Muslim majority countries. They all have relations with Israel. They all believe in democratic values. They can join. There's at least 10 democratic nations in Africa who are emerging democracies, broken democracies, or wish to uplift their democratic ideals. And there you've got 30 right there. That's more than started the United Nations, which was only 29. The first mission of the UN, of the CDN, of the Covenant of Democratic Nations, would be to revise and to amend, readopt, or strike down all international law and all the acts of the United Nations, whether it's UN 2334, there was this attempt to create this fictitious report that Israel is an apartheid state. And this report, as we know, after Halley's Comet hit, what I call Halley's Comet, hit the building and is burning a hole through the chambers, that report was immediately rejected, pulled off the UN website, and the executive director of the United States, of the UN Human Rights Commission, which we are funding to the tune of over $61 million a year. That organization, that director resigned. And all other forms of UN activity. All law needs to be updated. The very concept of occupation comes from the 1806 Hague Regulations, were first proposed by the Tsar of Russia, who was involved in an active genocide at that very moment. In the same way that the laws of slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, repression of human rights and civil rights in this country and other countries had to be updated for our present era. We need to update civil international law. And this can never be done by people who wish to use international law against one country and not against other countries, or use international law or the mechanisms of international law to allow injustice to prevail. As Pete Hoekstra said, and as I have said, everywhere around the planet where I've been interviewed or I've held a panel like this, the League of Nations started with a single speech by Woodrow Wilson in 1917. The League of Nations started when 5 men signed a small scrap of paper. I am not the Covenant of Democratic Nations. I'm not the Committee for the Covenant of Democratic Nations. I'm just a person in the conversation. And the conversation for the Covenant of Democratic Nations has begun. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. So now I'm going to throw one question to each of these esteemed people, and I'll have them answer in 3 minutes. And after that, 3 minutes. And after that, we'll take questions from the audience, from some of whom are esteemed representatives of their community. So let me first throw it to Sheldon Freilich. Shelley, you talked about all these people who have died under, while the United Nations, these millions of people who have died and slaughtered while the United Nations is holding sway. You talked about Cambodia, you talked about Rwanda, you talked about South Sudan and other areas. Why do you think the United Nations, the United States, because Marty made it clear the U.S. is a willing participant in this, why do you think the United States waited for for UN action before taking action or taking inaction? Is the UN actually an impediment to taking action multilaterally when there comes a point when morality forces nations to step up to the plate? Why do you think?
I think on one hand, the United States will not take action unless it views that situation is in its strategic or geopolitical interest.
And you're saying that
the United States won't take action unless it determines action is in its strategic or geopolitical interest.
And you're saying in the case of Syria that the proliferation of gas weapons could be transferred immediately against Israel, or could be used against American forces or any other forces.
And the previous administration refused to take action, and the current president just took action in the last couple of weeks. But he took unilateral action. He took unilateral action. But also, I think what motivated him was a realization that when something as heinous as gassing civilians and children, the United States, for its credibility and standing in the world, has to take action. If the United States doesn't, then it's going to be its position in the world is going to, and its influence is going to be decreased. And that's strategic also.
Okay, so thank you very much for that. Now, I'd like to throw a very controversial question to Marty. We've all heard about international law. Now, I've studied international law, and I'm not an international jurist. But I've asked this question of other great attorneys in the United States, including Nathan Lewin and many others. And so I'm going to ask Marty this question. And for us, it's going to be a pivotal question. Marty, when you think of law, the word law, well, like in Michigan, you have a law against murder. And whether you are a president or a pauper, you cannot commit murder. You'll each be treated allegedly equally. It is not your choice to be covered. And we look at international law, where you can throw a barrel bomb against Aleppo and you can stop an indictment of your own activities. You can extraterritorially take over property in the South China Sea that belongs to other countries. No one will stop you. You can bomb a hospital in Afghanistan, as we did, and it does not self-indict. Is there actually, in reality, anything such as international law, using law as a word that we know?
I've actually asked this question of our experts on the George Washington University faculty, and there are two aspects that we should think about. One is if there's a treaty, and then we can look at the treaty, and sometimes the treaty creates some judicial body. And I'll give you the European Union is a treaty, but there is a court in Luxembourg, pretty bad court actually, I mean not very competent according to the experts, but it sits in Luxembourg and it does interpret the treaty.
This is beyond the International Court of Justice in The Hague.
The International Court of Justice in The Hague is a misnomer. It is a creation of the United Nations Charter. It's a group that is picked by the General Assembly and basically is a big arbitration panel where people voluntarily, or countries voluntarily, go there and arbitrate disputes, which is a useful function. And then they can give arbitrary opinions, although I think that violated the charter. But in the case of the wall, which is such an embarrassment that I won't even speak about the judges.
Which wall?
The 2004 case, which said that the wall that Israel was building.
And you're talking about the advisory opinion of the
advisory committee, the advisory opinion came under the category that the General Assembly can ask, these people that they pay the salaries and pick, what do you think? And so the people who pay the salaries asked this body, what is the basis for the settlements being illegal? In other words, the settlements are illegal. What are the basis for it? You tell your boss what the boss wants to hear. And this is widely cited by international lawyers as customary international law. Now let me tell you something about customary international law. It's not a treaty based. It's the sort of the custom international lawyers say of nations. That nations behave in a certain way, so it makes customary international law. So I've asked my people, well, when you call the settlements in occupied territory, that's obviously nonsense, but one of the leading, maybe the leading international lawyer says, well, he cites customary international law, and then there's a professor at Northwestern University who says it's all nonsense. So who...
You're speaking of Eugene
Exactly. Exactly. And I was told by our leading scholar that of course people would follow James Crawford because he is more senior, more famous, and so I decided this whole field has no integrity at all.
Okay, let me just add some granulation to that response. The International Court of Justice was recreated by the United Nations. It was first created by the League of Nations as a means of avoiding military solutions to border disputes, maritime disputes, etc. And it's really a part of law that most of you know. It's contract law. The words in these treaties is the high contracting parties. The high contracting parties say, we agree that we will fish here and you will fish there, and that our border is here and your border is there. So there have been many, many border adjustments. This is all treaty law. This is all it's all contractual law. Now, when the United Nations took over these other agencies, they reasserted, when they took over the League of Nations, they reincarnated these agencies. Ironically, the first session of the International Court of Justice, in its first series of reports, adjudicated the Mavrotitis case, where someone sued, a Greek guy sued the Turks and the British, and he said, you know, I've got contracts with the Ottoman Empire and the British Mandate in Israel and in Jordan. Now you've got these new artificially created countries. Where do I take my dispute? So that was legitimate. It was that in 1920. I have a copy of it in my phone. If we had a projector, I would show it, but we don't. But I do show it in my lectures. That case said, no, under the new form of international law, these are two actual new countries. Take your dispute to Jordan, newly created. Take your dispute to Jewish Palestine, which became Israel under the movement that began with partition and with the partition effort, suggestion, and ended with the Declaration of Independence by the Jews to have a Jewish state. Lately, they've tried to make something called the International Criminal Court. But that too is another fiction, because the International Criminal Court, which tries to have a code of conduct that would address the type of genocide that Shelley was talking about, the membership of that court is by agreement. You have to agree to be accused in the International Criminal Court. And coincidentally, the United States is not part of that court. France is not part. Germany is not part. England is not that part. The United States, Israel is not part of that. And so it's really just the EU countries which victimized Africa to the point of cutting people's arms off because they didn't fetch enough rubber during the day as they did in the Belgian Congo. It is this group that is now judging the African nations that have joined the International Criminal Court. And of course, even South Africa has withdrawn from the criminal court. So people misunderstand these words. International Criminal Court only came into being a couple of years ago with the ratification of something called the Statute of Rome in 2003. And people misunderstand the International Court of Justice, and they misunderstand international law. Because in point of fact, the international law has been wielded by the people who have the power to right a wrong. And very often, as in World War II, the people who wielded the power to right a wrong were the Allies, and they created the Nuremberg International Military Tribunals, and those were retroactively imposed crimes against humanity, against the Nazis, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you for that excellent remark. I would just like to say, although he took 5 minutes to say what he was going to say, and I took 5 minutes to say what I was going to say, when I asked the same question to outstanding constitutional attorney Nathan Lewin in Washington, D.C., I said, is there such a thing as international law? He said, no.
Oh, I agree with you, but that's a simplistic answer.
That's why he gave me only one word. I don't think I was, enough time to agree. So now I'm going to ask a question to Bill Anderson. Now, Bill, when we see human rights abuses, the Yazidis, and I will just make this personal comment, history will never forgive America. We see the Shia, we see the Christians in the Middle East. We see we see the abuses of Boko Haram in Asia, in Africa. We see the Al-Shabaab in Somalia. What would be the role for, I'm not talking about an enforcement body, but what do you think would be the role for nations to finally say, we will intervene, we must stop this heinous genocide, and is the American interest simply strategic, or can America have a moral interest in not seeing people slaughtered? I give that thought.
Well, I think that the first part of that statement is apropos. That is, will America or any other country intervene unless it is in that country's best interest to do so? It's sort of like I speak about laws. Even the Constitution, I think, was a very well written document. But the fact that we have 9, I think, Supreme Court justices now who sit 150 years later telling us what that Constitution said. I'm saying that sometimes our laws are interpreted in light of who's sitting on that court. Now, I don't know what is the answer to how do we then go after these atrocities that are occurring all over the world. And what does it take for the United States now to take some aggressive action to try to stop those atrocities? I think when it becomes either in the best interest of the United States to get involved, or it does prick our conscience. And do I believe that this nation has a conscience? Yes, I do. Otherwise, Martin Luther King Jr. would have been hanged. He would have been lynched. Except that there were enough people in this country who had a conscience, and they believed enough in fairness and equity and justice that he was able to do the things that he did. And did he bring about change? Yes, he did. And I am a living witness that the things that he did made a difference. I have grandchildren now who live in Alabama who say to me, I didn't vote in the last election because I don't like either one of them. I said, wait a damn minute. Wait a minute. You vote whether you like them or not. I said, I voted for Nixon. Don't go out here and tell anybody that. Back in 1960, whatever, 61, 62, I voted. I voted for Nixon. Would you believe? Huh?
Yeah, you were right.
I couldn't stand him. No, wait a minute. But I did not vote for him because necessarily I supported him or his policies. It was establishing the principle of the right to vote. So I'm trying to teach them. I don't care if it's a red-tailed devil running for office and the opponent is Satan himself, vote.
Now,
Yeah.
I disagree with the dear doctor.
You can, okay.
Not voting when you can is a vote.
Oh, well.
No, I'm going to disagree with that.
Nobody
Just a
knows
second.
that.
Non-voting is not, well, it's true that non-voting is a vote, but by the same token, people who were hosed down for the right to vote find it too precious a right that we should not exercise a vote to choice. Now, hold on, we're going to take the question soon, but I would just like to say, and we're not going to have a colloquy here.
Right.
Yes, we are.
We're going to have some fun because that is a vote.
You cannot record that vote, the no vote.
No, you can't record it, but people who don't like either are voting. As long as they have the right to go to the poll.
That's it. You made a major statement there. As long as they have the right to go to the poll.
Exactly.
Right. And many people did not have the right to go to the poll.
But they also have the right to write in a third-party candidate. They have the right to write in the name.
And that's what I told my grandkids. I say, put my name down there for president of the United States.
No. But
He'd be great. However, if they put his name down, that's just like not.
Like not voting.
thank you very much.
Well, the point that I wanted to make was pure and simply this. As well written, and of course the Constitution of the United States has stood the test of time for centuries. Yet, we've got 9 people sitting up there who are interpreting it for us. Many of you have heard the name Bork. Bork. And when we say Bork, what do we mean?
We mean Clarence Thomas.
No. Going back before that. It was legal, supported by the Constitution of the United States, to have slaves. Bork was one of those who would have supported that because he said, I would have gone by what the Constitution says. And the Constitution said, it's all right to have slaves. Kill all the Jews. The Constitution said, kill all the Jews. There were those who, in Nazi Germany, felt that it was the law because Hitler said it. I'm saying there are times when even the law cannot be, should not be, shall not be, not should be followed to the letter.
Thank you.
Now he's being very controversial when you argue for that. The Constitution, as drafted, permitted states to have slavery. Many states did not recognize slavery at that time, others did. And that issue of slavery was put off by the drafters of the Constitution. And in England, it was the abolition movement that finally abolished slavery in 1832 throughout the British Empire. And that meant that Canada was free. And so we had the Underground Railroad.
All right, let me give further granulation. Let me give a further comment to all these remarks. Involving the 9 wise men, and in this case, nine wise men and women.
You haven't read their opinions.
Yeah.
Well, your opinion.
Anyway, and we will take questions in just a moment. But as far as they go, it is true that they are interpreting or reinterpreting the intent or updating the Constitution during their sessions. But I would just like to remind people that the Supreme Court approved the internment of the Japanese. I'd like to remind people that the Supreme Court approved what became a genocidal sterilization of 3 generations of
Imbeciles, I think. It was Justice Holmes.
It was Oliver Wendell Holmes in Buck versus Bell, who said it's better for all the world to execute 3 generations of imbeciles are enough to execute to terminate their kind now, rather than execute them for a future crime they haven't even committed in a future generation. That was done. And there are many other cases where the Supreme Court has ruled in a way that's inconsistent with our values. So that is something we have to cope with. That's a different conversation. We're not having the covenant of the Supreme Court. But I will also just comment that these laws can be inculcated in other jurisdictions, overseas, in the United Nations. I'd like to append what Dr. Anderson was talking about. Slavery was legal in the United States.
In some states.
Slavery, the importation was legal until 1806. 388,000 Africans were kidnapped into the United States, and another 80,000 came from the Caribbean basin into the United States. I would just like to mention that while 388,000 Africans were kidnapped into the United States, for 1,000 years before that, the Arab slave trade brought 15 million Africans out of Africa for slavery in the Middle East, and that slave trade has never stopped. And even Madagascar did not technically outlaw it until 2007, and we all know that slave trading is still going on throughout the Middle East, in Libya, in Tel Afar, and many other places. And so whatever Hitler did was done pursuant to law, as Bill Anderson did. There were regulations, there were decrees. And then after the Allies came in, and after Germany fell, they repealed all of those decrees, all of those laws. And now we have a United Nations which is passing resolutions and saying that international law trumps American law. And that includes the Iran nuclear deal and other deals. And people talk about unelected governance. Shall we be governed by people in a distant land who do not share our values? So I want to thank these gentlemen for the comments that they have made. And now I'm going to, they were all astute. And now I'm going to take questions from the crowd. And the first question goes to?
Now, if they ever can come back to their home villages in northern Iraq and adjacent areas, they need protection, they need safe areas, they need their own militia, they have a whole series of demands, and they've worked them out quite well, that they need if they can ever go back there.
And the question?
Now, the question is, legislation was introduced in the United States in the last Congress. It's going to be reintroduced to give them a variety of protections. The United States could theoretically be the guarantor of these protections. The United States, the President of the United States, is not the President of the world. So my question is, if the covenant of democratic nations were to be developed, how would it give them any more protection? How going forward would anybody be any more benefited than they are now by the useless UN? Would the United States end up having to fund both of them? Would it transfer its funding? And our experience with the League and with the UN has shown us it would be useless, and my assumption is the next organization would also be useless.
Okay, thank you for that excellent question. Let me answer as best I can. First of all, I'd like to say something that I omitted. If the Covenant of Democratic Nations comes into being, it will probably sunset itself, perhaps in a decade. There's no reason to believe that the Covenant of Democratic Nations would not become hijacked in a generation, just as the League of Nations was hijacked by the spread of Nazism, just like the United Nations was frozen in its effort to simulate justice and to achieve a democratic ideal. If we leave the UN just becomes a greater and greater satellite of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and or the Arab League. but we can be funding the Covenant of Democratic Nations while we are watching the United Nations collapse. This is what happened with the League of Nations. People were both in the League of Nations and they were inculcating the new United Nations. Now, your question goes to the issue of enforcement. What about joint action? The United Nations, the U.S. came up with the idea of the League of Nations and never joined. Congress vetoed it because it did not want to be dragged into a war that would be determined overseas. We do not want to be dragged into a war that would be determined by a Chapter 7 action and make us go overseas. I believe if the safe zones that you are speaking of, and remember, when it comes to refugees, there's always the question, do you relocate them or restore them? And that is the question of whether the safe zones should allow people to return. We listen to Syrian refugees, and many of them say, I want to get back to my country. Those who are not looking for economic advantage, but who are looking for liberty. And I believe that if the United States acted for the Christians in Syria and Iraq right now, they would do so multilaterally. They would create the safe zone that you have spoken of, and it would be outside a covenant of democratic nations and outside the United Nations. Remember, Chapter 7 of the United Nations specifically authorizes members to take all reasonable means. Justice was done, if I could use that word, in Syria several weeks ago, and the United Nations was not consulted. It was done over the objection of China and Russia, over their objection. But there was a measure of justice, and I think that you'll be seeing, based upon what I know, you'll be seeing more of that soon. The Syrians have already relocated the remaining 80% of their air force to Russian bases, to Latakia is one example. So I believe the answer is international organizations will not really work because everybody's got an agenda. We have to hope and pray that the outrage of righteous nations will rise to the fore when people are being slaughtered. That took America way too long in the case of the Jews. It took the Trump administration just a few hours in the case of the gassing of the people in Syria. I hope that begins to answer part of your question.
And can I help in answering her question? I'm Iraqi Christian. I come from Iraq and Europe.
Yes, I'm going to introduce my friend
Joseph Kassab.
Joseph Kassab, who represents the Chaldean community, and this is an example of the Christian community in Iraq. And the Chaldeans are one of many people in the Middle East who are called people of the book, and who have been stigmatized by the Nun, which is this letter.
Nun means Nazarene, means Christian.
Nazarene, which means Christian, in the same way that Jews in the Farhud in 1941 had the palm print, the Hamza, placed before the riot. I asked my friend to make a question.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having us. This is really important for us. Just I want to say that, the Chaldeans and the Jewish community have been friends for a long, long time, especially in Iraq. At the time that the Farhud took place in 1941 or in the 40s, the Christians were the people who hosted and hid the Jewish in their homes.
That's correct.
I just want to say that for the record. So we are cousins and we work together for these issues, humanitarian issues. I want to address your question. It's a really important question, and thank you very much for mentioning it. And thank you for writing the book too. Our experience tells us that the United Nations, and whether it is the League or United Nations, they did disappoint the Iraqi people, and mainly the minorities like the Christians, for many, many, many years, for over 100 years or so. And the reason for that is what I want to say is that Iraq and the Middle East was created. The reason for creating it is we go by a Dutton's call for divide to conquer. So that is exactly why the Middle East was divided so much, and also the North Africa countries. I want to say something very important. Iraq and other countries in the area, they were stripped off of their original name and ethnicity. And majority of them, for instance, Iraqis, originally they were Chaldeans and Assyrians and Syriac people. The Egyptians were the Pharaohs, as you know, all of you. The Lebanese were Phoenicians, and so is the Assyrians. The Libyans, they come from under many years of Italian ruling, and they have their own ancestor. So this is all changed, and I think the reason
As a result of the League of Nations.
as a result of that,
And the
they
League
did
of
not
Nations,
defend it.
and the League of Nations was motivated
Right.
by British Petroleum to quest for oil.
That's exactly right. Actually, the Brits did that more than anybody else. And then when the Ottoman came in, they made it even worse. The Ottoman persecuted the people, the Christians and others. And I'm sure all of you remember the 1915 massacre that took place in Turkey, where more than 1 million Armenians and also Chaldeans and Assyrians and Syriac people were massacred because of that. And we faced so many massacres. The thing is, as of today, and as we saw with the presence of ISIS, is that Christians and other minorities were not protected by the United Nations. Therefore, we reject the fact that the United Nations will be able to provide protection for these people, and I don't think they'll be able to, and there are many reasons for that. This is what our feeling is. There's an area in Iraq, a huge area, it's called Nineveh Plain. It's highly contested, and the United Nations got engaged in it for about 15, 20 years now, and never got resolved.
So the question is?
Yeah, the question is that we need more, we need to ask not only the U.S. administration, but the international community as a community, not as United Nations, to become involved and engage in saving the
Let me
people.
move that to a question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a great conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let me just say that I believe that the question is, when will the international community be mobilized to help the Christians in the Middle East? And the interesting formulation that Joseph made was international community. Now we're talking about the countries of conscience. Now we're talking about countries being motivated by their sense of morality, whether it's England or the United States or Australia. We're not waiting for a permission slip from the United Nations. And there's the living testament to it, a man whose own community has been decimated and is continuing to be decimated, starting with the unrighteous genocide against the Armenians in 1915, which included other people of the book, and what's going on right now that we see with ISIS. And it's a perfect living example in the room of the failure of the United Nations to uphold the dignity of man. Thank you for that question. My next one will come from Eugene. Yeah, I'm going to get everywhere. What time is now?
7:47.
How much time do we have for it? 5 to 7. Make it quick.
Well, I think the problem is that there's these massacres going on against the Chaldeans, the Yazidis, et cetera, but I don't think anyone in this country cares.
So the question is?
Why?
Why do we care?
Why don't we care?
Why don't we care? So the question is, why don't we care? And I'm turning that over to Bill Anderson.
Well, I've already answered that.
He's already answered it.
When it is in our best interest.
When is it in our best interest? And must we liberate Kuwait only when we're getting oil from Kuwait? Or are we going to intervene? The alleged strategic interest of the United States when Donald Trump sent off 59 Tomahawks, actually 60, one fell into the sea, was to stop the proliferation of gas weapons and to take action because the agreement made with the prior administration was broken in the UN treaty. That wasn't it. Everybody knows that was not it. He was moved. He was moved by the immorality, by the indecency. That is the strategic interest. Do we have a moral suasion that will cause us to intervene when Nazi Germany is oppressing Jews, when the Al-Shabaab are oppressing people, when ISIS is oppressing people? We couldn't have this conversation in this room last year. We couldn't have had this conversation in this room in the first 3 weeks of January. There is a climate now in the country and in the world to re-examine the United Nations and its monumental failures. So I believe we have an opportunity to reevaluate just what is in our strategic interest. And I say it's in our strategic interest to act when innocents are being massacred by the powerful, whether they're backed by Bashar al-Assad or Putin or Iran or anyone else. Now I've got time for one more question. I'll take this question here, then I'll take the gentleman from Kerala. I love Kerala. Would you like to? All right, fine. What is your name?
My name is Doreen Weisberg.
Okay, and what's your question?
The question,
How's it been so far?
interesting.
Good. All right, what's your question?
So it's geared towards some of the things that you said and Dr. Adelman, sort of a little bit for you too. The concept that you just recently, just as you were saying things over and over again, you are now focusing a little bit more on the concept of righteous nations and morality. So where there's an absence of righteousness, so that's where evil fills in this space.
Yes.
Okay. So, and you're talking about this concept of international laws, like what's going on here, there's no such thing. And yet, we were given international law. I'm going to come to it in a second.
Who's we?
The world. I'll come to it in a second. So the question is, if you recognize that evil has filled that space, moral instinct, have dedicated yourself to this project, you are up against the oil money and the rest of the money, the evil of Soros, the State Department, which at least since World War I has been Arabist. How do you get there when you are going against the base, Reagan called it the evil empire. And I will tell you my concept of the international law, which you can laugh at, and the concept of power. Because the power right now is with the money, and yet there's a bigger power.
We've got to make this a question.
The law is called Noahides law. And when we align our morality for the whole world with Noahides law, then the power comes from above and influences Donald Trump to do the right thing. And we add to that with prayer. Question is, if you don't do that, how are you going to overcome the money?
Okay. So, thank you very much. So I will just answer briefly, and then I'll turn it over to Shelley for a 1-minute rejoinder. I will just say, when you say, how can I possibly think I will succeed when I'm facing all the big oil money and all the established entrenched foundations and Soros and the State Department? Is that all? That's the only thing?
Yeah.
Look, just so you know, I stood up to IBM, Ford, General Motors, Carnegie, and Rockefeller. These guys are peaches compared to those guys. So that's how I'm going to do that. Now, as far as at what point do we get moral, we have to be careful before we say Gott mit uns, which is what the Germans said, God is with us. It was actually on the skull's head. Everybody has their own conversation with God, and ISIS believes that God is with them. So I believe something other than divine intervention must be the prime motivator. I'll just make that comment, but now, since I know that Sheldon is affiliated with a synagogue, Sheldon, what is your opinion? At what point does the moral imperative compel you to act, even though we have no interest in saving Jews in Czechoslovakia or in Germany, even though we have no interest, no strategic interest in bringing 400 girls back to their Nigerian parents? When, in a minute, what is the actual moral imperative? Give us.
Excuse me, very simply, Doreen mentioned the Noah.
Tell us what that is for those who don't know about Noah.
And tell us how to measure it after that. Go ahead.
How did I get?
That's your fault.
Let me just mention one law, and that is do not kill. That's one of the major 7 laws.
It's not do not kill, it's do not murder.
Thank you. So when you have all these actions of innocents being murdered, then we have an obligation and an obligation from God to take action. So that's our moral imperative.
Okay, so let me we're going to have to wrap it up because they're kicking us out at midnight. So let me talk to this gentleman. Come on up. Gentleman from Kerala. And he's one of the few people in the room who could actually call himself an optimist. You are an optimist, is that correct?
I'm the vice president of the West Bloomfield.
Of the Optimist Club. So give us your name.
My name is G.B. Timotheus, and I'm honored to be here today to meet you.
Thank you.
That thing doesn't work anyway.
That is not a room mic, that's for the camera. So speak up for these guys.
My name is G.B. Timotheus. I'm the vice president of the West Bloomfield Optimist Club. And as I was saying, it's an honor for me to be here. And I come from a corner of the world which has one of the oldest Jewish diasporas in the world, and also one of the oldest Christian communities in the world. And it's a community that lived in peace. It's the only community in the world where Jews were never persecuted. And they primarily went to Israel for the sake of Zionism and not because of persecution. So my input in this is, the question is, it has to go beyond strategic interests. There has to be a concern of the preservation of communities, not because, there are some strategic interest for us, but it is a preservation for humankind, because once these communities are gone, like Joe's community, the Chaldean community, we can never get it back. So it has to be a question of conscience.
Okay, well, I'm guessing, let me pull a question out of that. The question is, isn't it really one's conscience? Dr. Anderson said, I believe America has a conscience.
Yeah.
And
Hard to
another,
get to, but I believe America has
it's
one.
there, and part, I will quantify it if I can. There, but for the grace of God, walk I. All right, we're going to take our last question. And the last question comes from him.
Thank you.
What's your name?
Let me get to my spot first.
All right, get what's your name?
My name is Mitch Myerson.
Mitch Ransom, hi.
Nice to meet you.
How's it going so far?
I'm enjoying it immensely.
All right, speak to the crowd, but the little mic will record you for the
Okay.
camera.
Well, in your new organization, you say it's going to be open to democratic nations.
Only.
Only, right. And I believe Vladimir Putin was democratically elected. Would they be a candidate for your organization?
Okay, that's a
Wait,
great
no,
question.
that there's part 2.
Oh, it's a two-part question.
Okay. And then, how would your organization perceive the takeover of the Ukraine?
Okay.
Not the Ukraine, but the Crimea.
Crimea.
Right.
Crimea. Okay, so that's a great question. It'll be our last question, and I'll try to answer in a few ways. First off, voting rights and full rights would be limited to truly democratic countries, but certainly there are broken democracies, like Lebanon is a broken democracy, and there are emerging democracies, such as Rwanda, which is trying to pull itself up by its bootstraps. And just because a country has the name democratic in its name, the worst regimes in the history of the 20th century had the word democratic. I believe there was the DDR, the Democratic Deutsche Republic, which was East Germany. I believe that North Korea is called the Democratic Republic of North Korea. So that's like the tip-off. It's like you never want to go to the Chinese restaurant called Empress of China or something of that nature. So just because they have their name in the word democracy, we have seen what the opponents of democracy will do to expropriate that name. Second of all, there are non-democratic countries who will wish to be part of the covenant with non-voting rights. China, Russia, Venezuela, Afghanistan. There are many of them who can come in as observers or who can come in as associate members with non-voting rights. And why would they want to join? Because once the United Nations collapses, then these organizations like the World Health Organization and other disaster relief organizations will come into their third iteration. They've gone from the League of Nations to the United Nations. They'll go to the Covenant of Nations. They'll want increased trade, which will come with the Covenant of Democratic Nations. That's the enticement. And those nations will be uplifted, encouraged to strengthen their own democracies. We're doing that now in a very, very poor way around the world, in a very dysfunctional, ineffective way, but we're pretending to walk through that right now. And so these other countries will want to join in this as observers or associate members or non-voting members in the same way that Turkey is trying to get into the EU, which it never will, and other countries are trying to get into to other multilateral assemblies like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because there are benefits to being part of it, even if they're associate, even if they're observer. So now, what do we do about Crimea? Before we get into Crimea, we need to understand that Crimea has long been part of Russia, and these are more complicated issues than can be decided here. But let us say there's an egregious action, and let's say it's territorial. Let's say it's the South China Sea, and let's say that China is creating extraterritorial defense installations in territorial waters which are considered owned by Japan, the Philippines, et cetera, the South China Sea. The Covenant of Democratic Nations will not have a pretend military. It will not give some kind of cover for action or inaction as we have done, where we've gotten a resolution to justify something we were intending on doing anyway, like during the Korean War or something of that nature. But what the Covenant of Democratic Nations will do is facilitate the communication and joint action of individual members who wish to rise to the occasion. And that occasion should be the moral occasion that has been mentioned here. And right now, that moral occasion is being vetoed by the UN Security Council, which has made it impossible to take action even when babies are being gassed in front of our own eyes, because one member, Russia, or perhaps a second member, China, are in concert with a third member, Iran. We have a situation right now where North Korea, Germany, and Canada have the same equal vote in the UN. That is not a healthy idea. So all the countries in the world would deal with this in their own mature or immature way, and we would have to let the moral imperative rise when people need assistance, and we will have to let the international imperative arise when borders are involved or international borders are being crossed or threatened. Thank you very much. I will just make these closing remarks. What's the next step? 1, a declaration. 2, an international conference, an official conference of formal diplomats to draw up the paperwork. 3, a treaty convention like the Convention, where they actually propound the actual treaty. And then once the treaty is propounded, those countries that accept the treaty become signatories to the Covenant of Democratic Nations. This process could take as little as 2 years or as long as 20 years or never. It depends upon what we do next. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Convention, where they actually propound the actual treaty. And then once the treaty is propounded, those countries that accept the treaty become signatories to the Covenant of Democratic Nations. This process could take as little as 2 years or as long as 20 years or never. It depends upon what we do next. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.